Thank you, Wayne, very much for inviting me here. It's really interesting for me to learn about the SWICH project and to come and listen to such fascinating conversations, and I really enjoyed the conversations that I was fortunate enough to be part of yesterday as well. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about my background and where I'm coming from in all of this. I'm trained as a social anthropologist. I now work in a museum studies department, and I have worked for a long time in an ethnographic museum. I worked in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford for a long time, but my particular geographical and cultural area of interest is India, and for a much longer time than that. I'm currently working on a British Council and British Academy funded project with Indian colleagues looking at object engagements in museums in India. But for much longer than I've worked in India, I've worked in Southeast Asia, particularly with refugee communities on the Thai-Burma border. And that refugee work has been very formative on a lot of my thinking about objects in museums. And although I'm not going to talk about that work directly today, you may get a sense, perhaps indirectly at least, of how that's influencing some of the thinking that I do talk about today. There are three kind of key points, really, that I want to emphasize in what I do say. One is around this idea of encounter, and perhaps to some extent trying to reclaim that term to think a little bit about contemporary experiences in ethnographic museums. The second is around thinking about wonder, or perhaps other terms that we might want to use in what happens within those encounters in contemporary ethnographic museums. And the third thing that I'll just come to at the end, hopefully, if I don't run out of time, is something that Wayne mentioned at the very beginning of this morning, and that is to think a little bit about how the objects that are in our ethnographic museums in themselves constitute some kind of post-colonial policy, and is it useful for us to think about that to some extent. Okay, so to start with the question of encounter. What do I mean by that, and to what use can we put that term? So in a simple sense, I'm just talking about the kind of meeting between person and thing. But I'm not talking about what happens when people glance at things, when they just sort of drift through gallery spaces. I'm talking about the moments when people really stop to look at something, when something really catches their eye, particularly intrigues them, particularly appalls them even, when something really makes you stop and look. So in that sense, it's an encounter between an individual and an object that has a particular significance to it for one person's visit to the museum. But it's a dynamic process, and it's unique each time it happens. So for each one of us on different days, who knows what particular thing might trigger a moment like that, and what the results of it might be. Beyond that, of course, though, the word encounter is obviously a well-used and problematic term when we think about colonial contacts and activities. But although it's problematic in that context, I'd also like to think about its colonial context and actually use that in the sense of a kind of metaphor for some of the thinking that I want to do today. So if we see through, as it were, briefly, in a metaphorical sense, if we see through the eyes of a colonialist travelling 100 years ago to an overseas land for the first time, the places that they travel to, the things that they see, they seem exotic, they seem curious, they seem remote. So that new world as a whole becomes constructed. It becomes, in the colonialist's mind, it becomes something, or so we think, it becomes something remote and strange, something that, just to go to a quote from Edwin Ardner, the colonialist kind of imagines but constrains within physical boundaries, but the colonialist also sees as this thing that's sort of remote from their own central origin, if you like. So it's something peripheral, it's something distant from the colonial metropole. But of course, all of this in reality still is extremely complex. It's very nuanced. We can't generalize about all of this actually being the same. And within those complexities, one of the points about that, just to illustrate those complexities, is that peripheries didn't just exist overseas. Of course, peripheries existed within, for example, Britain as well. However, on an experiential level, so as Wayne said in his introduction to this session, we're now kind of zooming in to look at a very close encounter between person and thing, and zooming in to think about experience rather than institutions as a whole. To zoom into that experiential level, I think that we can extend a kind of analogy between colonial encounter on the one hand and encounter in the Ethnographic Museum on the other. Now, I know that a lot of you are probably thinking, oh, that sounds very glib and reductive, and it does, as far as I've gone so far. But please just bear with me just a little bit longer, okay? And I should also say, just to qualify the analogy that I'm making, that I'm not, in making that analogy, I'm not trying to make any kind of pejorative statement about visitors to museums. So I'm not trying to make any moral statement about what they might be thinking or judgments that they might make about the things that they see. And I'm also not trying to remove any kind of moral context from colonial histories either. I do think, however, that there is some kind of productiveness in taking this analogy a little bit further. So in both cases, the colonial traveller, the visitor to an ethnographic museum, and I'm thinking particularly about what we might think of as a relatively naive museum visitor, so that's not like anyone in this room, okay? In both cases, they come to somewhere that to them seems like a place that's perhaps quite wondrous. It's full of quite strange and amazing things. People do things quite differently there. Things are quite unfamiliar. And in both cases, the traveller, the visitor, is kind of out of their comfort zone. They're away from home. However, although the traveller, the visitor, is the person who's out of their comfort zone, it's kind of their way of seeing, their way of doing things that on this kind of micro-experiential level actually seems to come to dominate the engagements between herself, the traveller, the visitor, and the locals. And by the locals in the museum, I'm talking about the objects. I'm not talking about anything else except the objects themselves. So in the museum, that visitor, even if they are a so-called naive visitor, somebody who is not comfortable in a museum, not confident in a museum, it's still the visitor, not apparently the objects, which determine how that person moves around the museum, which directions they go, which artifacts they stop at, which things they look at in detail, which things they just glimpse at and pass on by, and how long they stay, and so on. Now, of course, we all know that in reality, museum methods, what objects museums select, how they juxtapose things, exhibition design, lighting, architecture, all those things, of course those things have a massive effect on what visitors actually do, how they look, what they choose to look at, and so on. But I and I'm not dismissing those museum methods in those processes, but I still want to focus in on the kind of micro level, if you like. And it seems as if in that encounter at that micro level, the locals, in inverted commas, the objects lying still and quiet in their cases, actually don't themselves kind of direct how the visitor looks and which way they move and so on. I should also say, kind of in qualifying this, that in developing this metaphor, I'm not trying to make it sound as if museums are places that simply are kind of exotifying things or othering things, and I'm also not trying to say that museums are sad places where objects are denatured or disempowered. And as I've already said, those kind of power relations between visitor and object, just as between colonizer and colonized, are actually very complex, often very ambivalent and fluid, and there are lots of things, as I've already said, that influence them. Just as one example of that, visitors, just like colonizers, don't come alone, and they don't necessarily find themselves alone once they've, or some of them come alone, but even if they come alone, they don't necessarily find themselves alone once they've got into the museum space. And social interactions within the space, or just the fact of having your experiences while other people are around you, can change what happens or change the nature of your experience. And there's work of plenty of interesting researchers like Dirk von Lem that show us that. Also, just as not all colonizers acted in the same way, neither do all visitors, as we know. So some of our museum visitors, we might say, objectify the locals in the colonized territory of the museum a bit less than others. So they might work harder to make a connection with the inhabitants of the cases as they pass by, being a lot more active in how they twist and move their bodies to gain alternative perspectives, pressing their noses to the glass, ignoring please don't touch signs, and things like that. But nonetheless, everything I've said so far and this whole metaphor is from the visitor's perspective, just as the whole perspective on which it's based, on which the metaphor is based, is from the colonizer's perspective. And of course, that's the problem. What about the other side? What about the other way of seeing? So in the museum case, what about the object's perspective? And why should we even bother to ask such a question? Well, we wouldn't say why bother if I was saying to you what about the perspective of those in the colonies. As Fanon, for example, talks about, and many other post-colonial theorists, the subaltern, we all know this, the colonized was not mute, is not mute, and the colonized didn't just kind of passively receive and be acted upon. Their characteristics, their behaviour, their very existence, in very different ways, in very different times, in very different places, had significant impact on colonizers as well, and on our collections as well. Albeit that they often found themselves having to communicate beyond the confines of their own communities, using the language and ideas of those in power rather than directly via their own means. But one of the things that interdisciplinary subaltern studies shows us is that hearing and understanding what the colonized subaltern have to tell us and recognizing those subjectivities and agencies in the traces of the colonized past and writing those histories is actually really difficult. And it's really difficult partly because historical records are largely written from the perspective of the powerful, the dominant, and there are often relatively few sources to which we can turn for those other perspectives. So again, we can extend the metaphor and say, how then do we think about the object's perspective? My analogy means that that helps us become even more aware of the severe difficulties in trying to see things from the object's perspective, and perhaps it prompts us to go beyond our established ways of thinking as well as our established sources, even if it's only as a methodological tool, even if it's just about using this metaphor as a way of thinking and as a way of practice, even if it's nothing more. It's ontologically problematical, but it's still perhaps a useful methodological tool to seek alternative ways of trying to understand viewpoints within museums. So let's imagine that objects do have a point of view. Let's imagine that in the encounters in museums that I'm talking about, the objects look back at the visitor just as much as she peers at them. Of course, that's not in itself an original suggestion. Many people have talked about the object gazing back. Carl Knappett, archaeologist, for example, amongst many others, says that in encountering, and I quote, startling pieces, we not only find ourselves looking at them, but them looking back. So, in those moments when we're intrigued, surprised, stirred, shaken by things, we feel their gaze returning ours, although we might not want to put it like that, we might not want to articulate it like that. They're powerful encounters in which we realise that that those artefacts have a power to affect us. They're transitory experiences, they're kind of moments in which perhaps dominant ways of knowing and established relations between our centre and the object periphery, if you like, become destabilised. So I would like to think about that as when they're particularly powerful, when they're moments that really make someone go wow, or even or be very emotionally and perhaps sometimes very physically moved. Sometimes they can be quite transformative experiences, that those powerful emotional and somatic effects of those kinds of encounters that perhaps we can think of in terms of wonder. So to feel wonder in that sense, it isn't about the need for something to be beautiful. It isn't an aesthetic in the sense of, well, I don't want to start talking about definitions of aesthetic, but it isn't a response in terms of the beauty of objects. It could happen in all sorts of ways with all sorts of things, and it will be different for different people depending on what they bring to that encounter. And it may happen without an individual knowing anything about the particular artifact that they encounter at all, or it may happen because of particular associations, triggers, connections, and so on that already happen, that they already have. But whatever, it kind of momentarily knocks you off course. And in the process of that, in those brief moments, the artifact is kind of no longer, just momentarily, it's no longer a sort of submissive representational tool, if you like. It's become wayward, it's become recalcitrant, and in a sense we could say it's become itself, it's allowed to be itself, not necessarily in being how it may have been in the past in a social functional sense, but in the sense that it can assert itself and refuse to submit to a hegemony and other set of expectations that are normally around it from the museum and the visitor alike. There are, just briefly, I might say, of course, there are a whole set of ethical issues perhaps around this. So some of us talked a little bit about trust and mistrust yesterday. I think that it might be, I won't say anything about that now because I'm aware that time is coming to an end, but I think it might be interesting to touch on that possibly in the discussion afterwards. One thing it might be interesting just to flag up briefly, which I think is an interesting ethical dimension of this, is if visitors have powerful responses to objects, which, sorry, that's my timer, shut up, that are very kind of unencumbered and very moving and perhaps happen despite or without any them knowing anything about what an object is, where it comes from, and so on. Oh, I've got more time than I thought I had. Thanks. And then they leave. So sometimes that happens, and then because of that powerful response, a visitor then decides that they want to find out more about an object. Fantastic. From a museum's point of view, that's great. Then that's kind of facilitating learning in a very powerful way. Sometimes the visitor then leaves, they haven't found out anything more about it, but they've had a very powerful experience, which may actually be quite a disturbing experience. It may be a very powerful experience of some kind of connection. It may be quite an empathic experience. It could be along a whole spectrum. And if they then leave the museum without having found out anything more about that object, and actually perhaps leave the museum with a whole set of misconceptions, perhaps quite negative, does that matter? A lot of people would think that that's really quite problematic. Others might think that the very fact that visitor has had such a powerful experience within the museum space, and as a result of their encounter with an object, in itself is enough, and actually in itself is really important. So, to kind of bring this to a close, I've been talking about encounters. I've been talking about within that, or through that, the potential potency of objects. And to think about that in our complex societies where the museums that you're thinking about through this project subsist, there are lots of possibilities there through those encounters, including the power to disturb, the power to connect, the power to trouble or to soothe, and so on. And as I say, there are many, they're as diverse as we are in the ways in which they can happen. So that's not really something that can be designed for, but perhaps we can design for not foreclosing those possibilities. But to end on that, if we return to the kind of colonial analogy and thinking about the nature of those spaces and the nature of those encounters between visitors and things, our museums and our collections that are at the heart of these now very diverse metropolitan centres in our cosmopolitan polities or nations are, I think, it was the first speaker in the last session who talked particularly about the possibility of dislocated objects. I've been thinking about that too, although I've been thinking about them as displaced rather than dislocated, but it's a similar kind of idea. And maybe displaced or dislocated is something that relates to the idea of those objects being themselves migrants. So in the museum space, our objects are migrants themselves. Perhaps that makes the museum, the collection itself, a post-colonial polity because those objects come from so many different places. But beyond that, there is a sense, I feel, that when you go into an ethnographic museum, there is a solidarity between the objects that are within those spaces. There's a kind of what John Davis, who's a British anthropologist, wrote about some time ago when he was writing about refugees, a kind of bond of suffering. suffering sounds a slightly pejorative word to use in this context, but what he means by that is it's a sense of shared experience, of where the fact that when he's talking about refugees, people have been through a similar experience and they have a shared sense of loss in terms of things that have, and again, we talked about this a bit in the last session, things that are still with you but are no longer with you physically, and sometimes shared experience in a very traumatic physical way as well, which again is the case for some of our objects, but not all. I think that we can think about that in relation to our collections, and that also connects to something that Victor Turner talked about a lot, which is the idea of communitas. And if we think about to what extent is there a sense of communitas in our museum collections, and to what extent then are our collections, and thinking back to what I've been talking about in terms of those powerful encounters that can actually take momentarily both visitor and object, when those encounters happen outside the kind of norms of everyday life, both outside the museum for the visitor and their normal expectations of a museum visit for the visitor, and everyday life inside the museum for the object. That, again, reminds us of Victor Turner in a sense, because it's about it's about taking us outside, it's about the betwixt and between, it's about taking us outside the kind of norms of everyday life, and it's about the subjunctive mood, which is what he talks about when he talks about the liminal phase of ritual. It's about the subjunctive mood of society. It's about that opportunity for imagination, for alterity in the sense of different ways of thinking and understanding and feeling about both what's happening now, our experiences in contemporary polities, but also in relation to the past. And I'll stop there. Thanks.